Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Martinez stepped off the military transport bus at Fort Harrison, her boots hitting the dusty ground of what would be her new home for the next 2 years. The Colorado military base stretched before her like a small city, with rows of identical buildings and perfectly manicured lawns that spoke of military precision. At 34, Rebecca had seen enough bases to know that each one came with its own challenges. But something about this place felt different. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade grounds as she made her way to the administration building, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Her dark hair was pulled back in the regulation bun, and her uniform pressed to perfection. She had learned long ago that first impressions mattered, especially for a woman in her position. "Must be the new operations officer," came a voice from behind her. Rebecca turned to see a man in his 40s approaching, his captain's bars gleaming in the sunlight. He had the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Captain Derek Wilson, I run the logistics department here." "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez," she replied, extending her hand for a firm handshake. She noticed how his eyes swept over her, taking in her small frame and youthful appearance. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well, I'll be giving out those ranks pretty easily these days, aren't they?" His tone was light, almost joking, but Rebecca caught the edge beneath it. She kept her expression neutral. "I earned every stripe, Captain." "Oh, I'm sure you did," Wilson said, his smile widening. "It's just unusual to see someone so young in such a high position. Must have had some good mentors looking out for you." Rebecca felt the familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had heard variations of this conversation countless times before. The implication was always the same, that her success was due to something other than her own merit. "If you'll excuse me, Captain, I need to report to Colonel Hayes." Of course, just trying to be friendly. "You'll find things work a little differently here at Fort Harrison. We're like a family. Everyone knows everyone, and we all look out for each other." Wilson's tone suggested there was more meaning behind his words than simple welcome. Rebecca nodded politely, and continued toward the administration building. As she walked away, she could feel Wilson's eyes on her back, and she heard him chuckle quietly to himself. The administration building was a typical military structure, all beige walls and fluorescent lighting. Rebecca found Colonel Hayes's office on the second floor and knocked on the door. "Enter," came a gruff voice from inside. Colonel James Hayes was exactly what Rebecca had expected from their phone conversations. A career military man in his 50s with graying hair and tired eyes. He looked up from his paperwork as she entered and stood at attention. "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez reporting for duty, sir." Hayes stood and returned her salute before gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "At ease, Martinez. Have a seat. How was the trip from Fort Bragg?" "Smooth, sir, and no complications." Good. Hayes shuffled through some papers on his desk. "I'll be honest with you, Martinez. When they told me they were sending a lieutenant colonel to take over operations, I was expecting someone with a bit more experience." Rebecca kept her voice steady. "I have 12 years of active duty, sir. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. I've served in operations roles for the past 4 years. Yes, I've read your file. Impressive on paper, certainly." Hayes leaned back in his chair. "But Fort Harrison isn't a combat zone. We have different challenges here. This is a tight-knit community, and change doesn't always come easy. Some of the men have been here for years, decades even. They have their ways of doing things." "I understand, sir. I'm here to support the mission, not to disrupt it unnecessarily." Hayes nodded, though something in his expression suggested skepticism. "Your predecessor, Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, was very popular with the troops. He understood how things worked around here. Big shoes to fill." Rebecca had heard about Johnson from her contacts at the Pentagon. He had been well liked, certainly, but his methods had been questionable. There had been reports of favoritism, cutting corners on safety protocols, and a general lack of accountability that had ultimately led to his reassignment. But she wasn't about to mention that to Hayes. "I'll do my best to maintain the high standards the unit is known for, sir." "I'm sure you will." Hayes handed her a folder. "This contains your housing assignment, base map, and schedule for the next few days. You'll be meeting with department heads, getting oriented. Your first staff meeting is Monday morning at 0800. "Thank you, sir." As Rebecca stood to leave, Hayes called after her. "One more thing, Martinez. Admiral Thompson will be conducting an inspection next month. It's very important that everything goes smoothly. The Admiral has high expectations, and frankly, this base can't afford any black marks on our record." "Understood, sir. You can count on me." Hayes nodded dismissively, already turning his attention back to his paperwork. Rebecca left his office, feeling the weight of unspoken expectations and barely concealed doubt. Her assigned quarters were in the officer housing area, a small apartment that would serve as her home for the foreseeable future. As she unpacked her belongings, Rebecca allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had known this assignment would be challenging, but not because of the work itself. The real challenge would be proving herself to men who had already decided she didn't belong. She carefully hung her dress uniform in the closet, making sure it was perfectly aligned. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate process of earning respect in a place where respect seemed to be reserved for a select few. She had faced similar challenges before and overcome them, but something about Fort Harrison felt different. There was an undercurrent of resistance that went beyond the usual skepticism she encountered as a woman in a male-dominated field. As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, Rebecca stood at her window looking out at the base that would be her home. She thought about the phone call she had received from her sister Maria just before leaving Fort Bragg. "Why do you keep doing this to yourself, Becca?" Maria had asked. "You've proven yourself 100 times over. Why not take that desk job at the Pentagon? Let someone else fight these battles." But Rebecca knew she couldn't stop fighting. Every woman who would come after her deserved better than what she had faced. Every female soldier who dreamed of advancing in the ranks needed someone to break down the barriers that still existed. Despite what the official policies might say, she touched the small scar on her neck, barely visible above her collar, and remembered the promise she had made to herself years ago. She would never back down, never give up, and never let anyone make her feel like she didn't belong in the uniform she wore with pride. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve, but tonight, she would rest and prepare for the battles ahead. Fort Harrison didn't know it yet, but they were about to meet a force they weren't prepared for. Rebecca's first week at Fort Harrison passed in a blur of meetings, briefings, and carefully orchestrated encounters designed to test her mettle. She quickly learned that the base operated on an unofficial hierarchy that had little to do with actual rank, and everything to do with how long someone had been part of the Fort Harrison family. It was during her second Monday morning staff meeting that the real resistance began to show itself. Rebecca sat at the conference table, surrounded by department heads, most of whom were men who had been at the base for years. The meeting was supposed to cover routine operational matters, but it quickly became clear that her presence was being treated as anything but routine. "The supply convoy routes need to be updated," Rebecca said, pointing to the map displayed on the wall screen. "The current paths take unnecessary risks through areas that have been flagged for road maintenance. We can cut transport time by 15% and improve safety by rerouting through the Eastern Gate." Major Frank Rodriguez, the transportation officer, leaned back in his chair with a slight smirk. "With all due respect, ma'am, we've been using these routes for over 5 years without incident. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. The old ways aren't always the safest ways." "Major," Rebecca replied calmly, "I've reviewed the maintenance reports and traffic incident data. The statistics support the change." Captain Wilson, whom she had met on her first day, chimed in. "Statistics are one thing, but you have to understand the reality on the ground. These routes have been tested over time. We know every pothole, every turn, every potential problem. That kind of knowledge can't be replaced by numbers on a page." Rebecca felt the familiar tension building in the room. Every eye was on her, waiting to see how she would respond to the challenge. She had learned long ago that backing down was never an option, but she also knew that bulldozing through opposition would only create more resistance. "I appreciate the value of experience, gentlemen. That's exactly why I'm recommending we send out reconnaissance teams to survey the new routes before making any permanent changes. We can combine the institutional knowledge you've built with updated safety protocols." The room fell silent for a moment. Rebecca could see some heads nodding in approval while others maintained skeptical expressions. Major Tom Bradley, the base security chief, finally spoke up. "That sounds reasonable. My team can handle the security assessment of the new routes." "Thank you, Major Bradley. I'd like to have preliminary reports by the end of the week." As the meeting continued, Rebecca noticed a pattern emerging. Every suggestion she made was met with either subtle resistance or overly detailed explanations of why things were done a certain way. It wasn't outright insubordination, but it was clear that her authority was being tested at every turn. After the meeting, Captain Wilson lingered as the others filed out. "Lieutenant Colonel, might I have a word?" Rebecca gathered her papers and nodded. "Of course, Captain. I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but I wanted to give you some friendly advice. The troops here are set in their ways. They're good soldiers, but they don't warm up to change quickly. Maybe it would be better to ease into things rather than making waves right out of the gate. I appreciate your concern, Captain, but I'm not here to make waves. I'm here to ensure operational efficiency and safety. If that happens to coincide with change, then so be it. Wilson's smile tightened slightly. Just trying to help. Some of the guys are already talking, wondering if you have the experience to handle a base this size. I've been telling them to give you a chance. But, double quotes, but what, Captain? Well, it's just that your predecessor was one of us. He understood how things worked around here. He didn't need to rely on reports and statistics because he had been in the trenches with us. Rebecca set down her papers and looked Wilson directly in the eye. Captain, let me be clear about something. I have been in trenches you can't even imagine. I've made decisions under enemy fire that most people will never have to face. I don't need to prove my credentials to you or anyone else on this base. What I need is for my officers to execute their duties with professionalism and respect. For the chain of command, can I count on you for that? Wilson's face flushed slightly, but he maintained his composure. Of course, ma'am, I was just trying to be helpful. I'm sure you were. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. As Wilson left, Rebecca felt the weight of the challenge ahead of her. She had faced resistance before, but this felt more organized, more deliberate. It was as if the entire base had decided to test her resolve from day one. That afternoon, Rebecca decided to tour the motor pool to get a first-hand look at the vehicles and equipment under her command. She found Major Rodriguez inspecting a convoy of trucks that had just returned from a supply run. Major, how did the Eastern Route survey go? Rodriguez looked up from his clipboard with surprise. Survey, ma'am. I thought we were going to discuss that more before moving forward. I specifically requested reconnaissance teams be sent out this week. Was my directive not clear? Well, yes, ma'am. But Captain Wilson mentioned that you might want to reconsider the timeline. Said you were still getting oriented and might want to take things slower. Rebecca felt a flash of anger but kept her voice level. Captain Wilson doesn't speak for me. Major, when I give a direct order, I expect it to be followed unless there are legitimate operational concerns. Are there any operational concerns preventing the survey? No, ma'am. I can have teams out tomorrow morning. Good. I want preliminary reports on my desk by Friday afternoon. As she walked away from the motor pool, Rebecca realized that her authority was being undermined in ways both subtle and direct. Captain Wilson seemed to be positioning himself as an interpreter of her intentions, softening her orders and creating delays in their execution. That evening, Rebecca sat in her quarters reviewing personnel files. She was looking for allies, officers who might be more receptive to her leadership style. Major Bradley seemed promising. He had been professional and supportive during the meeting. Major Sandra Walsh from the Medical Corps had also been respectful and engaged. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her mentor, Brigadier General Patricia Stone, calling from the Pentagon. Rebecca, how are you settling in at Fort Harrison? It's been interesting, General Stone. Definitely some challenges, but nothing I can't handle. I heard through the grapevine that you're dealing with some resistance. Is that accurate? Rebecca hesitated. She didn't want to appear weak or unable to handle her assignment, but she also valued General Stone's counsel. There's been some testing of boundaries. Yes. It's not unusual for a new commander, especially in a close-knit unit like this one, Rebecca. I'm going to give you some advice that I wish someone had given me 20 years ago. Don't try to prove yourself by being one of the boys. Don't compromise your standards to gain acceptance. Lead with integrity and competence, and let your results speak for themselves. Yes, ma'am, that's exactly what I intend to do. Good. And Rebecca, if things get out of hand, don't hesitate to call. Sometimes these old boys clubs need a reality check from higher up the chain. After the call ended, Rebecca felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for her own authority, she was fighting for every woman who would follow in her footsteps. The resistance she was facing wasn't just about her being new or different, it was about her being a woman in a position of power. And some people couldn't accept that reality. As she prepared for bed, Rebecca caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The scar on her neck was barely visible, but she touched it reflexively, remembering the day she had earned it, and so many others. Her scars told the story of her service, her sacrifice, and her courage. They were proof of her right to wear the uniform and command respects. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she was ready for them. Fort Harrison would learn to respect her authority, one way or another. 3 weeks into her assignment, Rebecca had made modest progress in some areas while facing continued resistance. In others, the reconnaissance reports on the new convoy routes had come back positive, supporting her initial assessment, but implementation had been delayed due to what Major Rodriguez called logistical complications. It was during a routine inspection of the armory that Rebecca encountered her most direct challenge yet. She had arrived unannounced, as was her practice, wanting to observe operations as they normally occurred rather than in the sanitized version that often accompanied scheduled visits. Sergeant First Class Mike Thompson was briefing a group of junior enlisted soldiers on weapons maintenance procedures. Rebecca stood quietly at the back of the room, observing the training session. "Remember, these weapons are your lifeline," Thompson was saying. "You treat them with respect, and they'll keep you alive. But you also need to remember that in the real world, it's not just about following every regulation to the letter. Sometimes you need to use common sense." Rebecca frowned. Weapons safety protocols weren't suggestions, they were absolute requirements that had been written in blood over decades of military experience. "For example," Thompson continued, apparently unaware of Rebecca's presence, "the manual says, you should never modify your weapon without authorization. But sometimes a little creativity can make the difference between completing the mission and coming home in a body bag." "Sergeant Thompson," Rebecca said, stepping forward. "May I have a word with you?" Thompson turned, his expression shifting from casual confidence to forced respect. "Of course, ma'am." Rebecca waited as the junior soldiers filed out of the room, then addressed Thompson directly. "Sergeant, I'm concerned about some of the guidance you were giving those soldiers, ma'am. Specifically, your comments about modifying weapons without authorization and treating regulations as guidelines rather than requirements." Thompson's jaw tightened slightly. "With respect, ma'am, I was sharing practical experience. Sometimes the book doesn't cover every situation you'll face in the field. The book, as you call it, exists to keep soldiers alive. Those regulations are written based on lessons learned from soldiers who paid the ultimate price for not following proper procedures. I understand that, ma'am, but I've been training soldiers for 15 years. I've served in combat zones where following every regulation to the letter could get you killed. These kids need to know how things really work." Rebecca felt her temper rising but kept her voice steady. "Sergeant, those kids need to know that safety protocols are non-negotiable. If you have concerns about specific regulations being inadequate for combat situations, there are proper channels for addressing those concerns. Encouraging soldiers to improvise with weapons modifications is not one of them." Thompson's posture became more defiant. "Lieutenant Colonel Johnson never had a problem with my training methods. He understood that experience counts for something there." It was the comparison that had been hanging in the air since her arrival. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, the beloved predecessor who apparently never questioned anything and let everyone do things their own way. "Lieutenant Colonel Johnson is no longer in command here. Sergeant, I am, and under my command, we will follow established safety protocols without exception. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, ma'am." Thompson's tone was respectful, but his eyes held a hardness that suggested the conversation was far from over. Later that afternoon, Rebecca was in her office reviewing budget reports when Major Bradley knocked on her door. "Come in, Tom." Bradley entered and closed the door behind him, his expression serious. "Ma'am, I think you should know about something that's been circulating among the NCOs." Rebecca looked up from her papers. "What kind of something?" "There's been talk about your leadership style. Some of the senior enlisted are saying you're too rigid, that you don't trust their experience or judgment. And what's your assessment, Major?" Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I think you're doing a good job overall, but maybe there's a way to accomplish your goals without making people feel like their years of service don't count for anything." Rebecca set down her pen and studied Bradley's face. She had hoped he would be an ally, but now she wondered if he was just more diplomatic in his resistance than the others. "Tom, let me ask you something. If a male lieutenant colonel had come in here and insisted on following proper safety protocols, would the NCOs be questioning his leadership style?" Bradley paused, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "That's not really the issue, ma'am. I think it's exactly the issue. I think there are people on this base who have decided that a woman can't possibly know how to command, and they're looking for any excuse to undermine my authority." "Ma'am, I don't think let me finish." Rebecca stood and walked around her desk. "I've been in the Army for 12 years. I've served in combat zones where the margin for error was measured in lives, not just efficiency reports. I've earned every rank I hold, and I've earned the right to lead this unit. If some people can't accept that, that's their problem to solve, not mine." Bradley nodded slowly. "I understand. Ma'am, I'm just trying to help you navigate the politics of the situation. I appreciate that, Tom, but I'm not here to play politics. I'm here to command this unit with integrity and professionalism. Anyone who has a problem with that can request a transfer. After Bradley left, Rebecca sat alone in her office, feeling the weight of isolation that came with command. It was a familiar feeling, one she had experienced at every assignment throughout her career. The difference was that, at Fort Harrison, the isolation felt more intentional, more coordinated that evening. Rebecca decided to visit the enlisted dining facility, something Lieutenant Colonel Johnson had apparently never done, according to the surprised looks she received. She went through the serving line like any other soldier, engaging in casual conversation with the staff and finding a seat among the junior enlisted personnel. The conversations around her gradually quieted as word spread of her presence. She could feel eyes on her as she ate, and she caught snippets of whispered conversations. Double quotes. Never seen an LTC in here before. Heard she's been riding the NCOs pretty hard. My buddy in supply says she's changing everything. Rebecca finished her meal and stood to leave, nodding politely to the soldiers around her. As she walked toward the exit, she heard a voice call out behind her. Ma'am, it was a young private, probably no more than 19 years old. Could I speak with you for a moment? Rebecca stopped and turned. Of course, Private Jackson, ma'am, Emily Jackson. Rebecca noticed the looks of surprise from the other soldiers. Apparently, directly approaching a lieutenant colonel wasn't common practice at Fort Harrison. What can I do for you, Private Jackson? Ma'am, I just wanted to say that some of us appreciate the changes you're making, the safety protocols and the attention to proper procedures. My last base had some incidents that could have been prevented if people had followed the rules. Rebecca felt a spark of hope. Thank you, Private. That means a lot. Yes, ma'am, and ma'am, don't let them wear you down. Some of us are watching and we're rooting for you. As Rebecca walked back to her quarters, she thought about Private Jackson's words. For every voice of resistance, there might be others who supported her leadership but were afraid to speak up. The question was whether she could build enough support to overcome the organized opposition she was facing. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Hayes. Admiral Thompson's inspection has been moved up to next week. Meeting tomorrow 0700 to discuss preparations. Rebecca stared at the message, feeling a knot form in her stomach. Admiral Thompson's inspection would be the ultimate test of her leadership. If things went poorly, it could mean the end of her career at Fort Harrison and possibly her advancement prospects in the Army. She had 1 week to prove that her methods worked, that her leadership was effective, and that Fort Harrison was better under her command than it had been under her predecessor. The stakes couldn't be higher, and she knew that every person who had been undermining her authority would be watching, waiting for her to fail. But failure wasn't an option. Too much depended on her success, not just for her own career, but for every woman who would follow in her footsteps. He would find a way to succeed, no matter what obstacles were placed in her path. Admiral Richard Thompson's inspection was set to begin on Monday morning, giving Rebecca exactly 4 days to ensure everything was perfect. She had spent the weekend reviewing every procedure, every protocol, and every detail that might come under scrutiny. By Sunday evening, she felt as prepared as possible, but a nagging worry persisted in the back of her mind. Monday morning arrived, with a kind of crisp Colorado air that made everything seem sharper, more immediate. Rebecca stood at attention on the parade grounds as Admiral Thompson's helicopter touched down, its rotors creating a whirlwind of dust and debris. The Admiral emerged, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of bearing that commanded instant respect. Admiral Thompson, welcome to Fort Harrison, Colonel Hayes said, stepping forward to greet the visiting dignitary. Colonel Hayes, good to see you again. Thompson's voice carried the authority of decades in command. His eyes swept across the assembled officers, stopping briefly on Rebecca. I trust everything is ready for the inspection. Yes, sir. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez has been coordinating all preparations. Thompson nodded in Rebecca's direction. Lieutenant Colonel, I'll be interested to see how you've settled in here. I understand you're relatively new to the command. Yes, sir. For weeks as of today, I'm confident you'll find everything in order. The first day of inspection went smoothly. Admiral Thompson toured the facilities, reviewed operational procedures, and observed training exercises. Rebecca noticed that her officers were performing flawlessly, following every protocol to the letter. Even Captain Wilson seemed to be on his best behavior, showing none of the subtle resistance she had grown accustomed to. But it was on Tuesday afternoon that everything began to unravel. Rebecca was escorting Admiral Thompson through the armory when they encountered Sergeant Thompson conducting a weapons training session. "Carry on," Sergeant Admiral Thompson said as they entered the training area. "Yes, sir." Sergeant Thompson turned back to his group of junior soldiers. "As I was saying, these modifications can improve accuracy in certain situations. Of course, you'll need to check with your command before making any changes, but in the field, sometimes you have to adapt." Rebecca felt her blood run cold. Despite their conversation the previous week, Sergeant Thompson was still encouraging unauthorized weapon modifications. Admiral Thompson's expression remained neutral, but she could see his attention sharpen. "Sergeant," Admiral Thompson interrupted, "what kind of modifications are you referring to?" Sergeant Thompson glanced nervously at Rebecca before responding. "Well, sir, just minor adjustments that experienced soldiers sometimes make to improve performance, nothing major." "I see. And these modifications have been approved through proper channels?" "Well, sir, not officially, but that's enough," Sergeant Rebecca interjected. "Admiral Thompson, perhaps we should continue the tour." But Admiral Thompson wasn't finished. "Lieutenant Colonel, I'd like to hear more about these modification procedures. Is this standard practice at Fort Harrison?" Rebecca felt the walls closing in around her. "No, sir, it is not." Sergeant Thompson was misinformed about policy. Misinformed? Admiral Thompson's eyebrows rose. "Sergeant, how long have you been conducting training here?" 15 years, sir. "And this is the first time you've been informed that unauthorized weapon modifications are against regulation?" Sergeant Thompson looked confused and defensive. "Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Johnson never said anything about it. This is the first time anyone has questioned my methods." Admiral Thompson turned to Rebecca, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant Colonel, perhaps we should discuss this privately." Rebecca's heart was pounding as she led Admiral Thompson to a small office adjacent to the armory. This was exactly the kind of situation that could destroy a career, and she knew it. "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez," Admiral Thompson began once the door was closed, "how long have you been aware of these training practices?" "I discovered them 3 weeks ago, sir," and immediately addressed the issue with Sergeant Thompson. "And yet he continued the same practices today." "Yes, sir, it appears my directive was not followed." Admiral Thompson studied her for a long moment. "In my experience, when directives are not followed, it's usually for one of two reasons. Either the directive was unclear, or there's a failure of leadership. Which do you think applies in this situation?" Rebecca felt the weight of the moment. Her career, her future, everything she had worked for hung in the balance. "Sir, I believe my directive was clear. The failure appears to be in the implementation and oversight." "I see. And what steps have you taken to ensure compliance with your directives?" "I've been conducting regular inspections and working to establish clear channels of communication with all department heads and senior NCOs." Admiral Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "Lieutenant Colonel, I've been doing inspections for more years than I care to count. I've seen good commanders and bad ones, effective leaders and ineffective ones. What I've observed here suggests that you're facing resistance that goes beyond normal adjustment periods for new command assignments." Rebecca wasn't sure how to respond. Admitting to problems with her command could be seen as weakness, but denying the obvious would be dishonest. "Sir, there have been some challenges in establishing new procedures and ensuring compliance with existing regulations. That's a diplomatic way of putting it." Admiral Thompson walked to the window, looking out at the base grounds. "Lieutenant Colonel, may I ask you a personal question?" "Of course, sir. Why did you choose a career in the military?" The question caught Rebecca off guard. "Sir, I joined because I wanted to serve my country and make a difference. I stayed because I believe in the values and principles that the military represents." "And have you found that your gender has presented additional challenges in your career?" Rebecca hesitated. This was dangerous territory, but Admiral Thompson's tone suggested genuine interest rather than a trap. "Yes, sir, it has. But I've always believed that performance and competence should speak louder than any other considerations." Admiral Thompson turned back to face her, an admirable philosophy. "However, I suspect that not everyone shares your view." Before Rebecca could respond, there was a knock on the door. Colonel Hayes entered, looking concerned. "Admiral Thompson, I apologize for the interruption, but there's been an incident in the motor pool that requires immediate attention." The 3 officers made their way quickly to the motor pool, where they found Major Rodriguez standing next to a military truck with its hood open. Steam was rising from the engine compartment. "What happened, Major?" Rebecca asked. "Engine overheated during routine operations, ma'am. We're checking to see if it's related to the new route requirements." Admiral Thompson stepped closer to examine the vehicle. How many miles are on this truck, Major? About 80,000, sir. And when was the last scheduled maintenance? Rodriguez consulted his clipboard. According to the records, it should have been last month, but we had to delay it due to operational requirements. Rebecca felt another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Major, what operational requirements prevented scheduled maintenance? Well, ma'am, we've been short-staffed, and the additional reconnaissance missions for the route surveys have stretched our resources thin. Admiral Thompson looked at Rebecca with interest. Route surveys, Lieutenant Colonel. Yes, sir. I ordered surveys of alternative convoy routes to improve safety and efficiency, and these surveys have impacted maintenance schedules. Rebecca realized she was being maneuvered into a corner. Either the surveys were unnecessary and wasteful, or they were necessary but poorly planned. Either way, it reflected poorly on her leadership. Sir, the surveys were essential for operational safety, but it appears the implementation may have created unintended consequences. Admiral Thompson nodded slowly. I see, Colonel Hayes. I think I've seen enough for today. I'd like to continue the inspection tomorrow morning with individual meetings with department heads. That evening, Rebecca sat in her quarters feeling the weight of impending failure. Everything that could go wrong seemed to be going wrong, and she suspected it wasn't entirely coincidental. The timing of the engine failure, the persistence of Sergeant Thompson's unauthorized training methods, the convenient delays in maintenance schedules, it all felt orchestrated. Her phone rang, and she saw it was General Stone calling from the Pentagon. Rebecca, I heard Admiral Thompson is conducting his inspection. How is it going? Rebecca took a deep breath. Not well, General. I think I'm being set up to fail. What do you mean? Rebecca explained the events of the day, the pattern of resistance she had been facing, and her growing suspicion that some of her officers were deliberately undermining her authority. Rebecca, that's a serious accusation. Do you have any proof? Nothing concrete, but the pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. General Stone was quiet for a moment. Rebecca, I'm going to tell you something that I probably shouldn't. There have been informal complaints made about your leadership style. Some people have suggested that you're not ready for command at this level. Rebecca felt her heart sink. What kind of complaints? The usual things. Too rigid, doesn't understand how things work, alienating experienced personnel. The kind of complaints that could end a career if they come from the right people. General, I've done everything by the book. I've followed every regulation and procedure. I know you have, Rebecca, but sometimes doing everything right isn't enough. Sometimes you have to be smarter than your opponents. After the call ended, Rebecca stared at the ceiling of her quarters, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her military career. Tomorrow would bring the final day of Admiral Thompson's inspection, and she suspected it would also bring the end of her command at Fort Harrison. But as she lay there in the darkness, Rebecca made a decision. If they wanted to destroy her career, she wasn't going to make it easy for them. She was going to fight back, and she was going to expose the truth about what was really happening at Fort Harrison, no matter what it cost her. Wednesday morning brought an unusual stillness to Fort Harrison, as if the entire base was holding its breath, waiting for the final act of Admiral Thompson's inspection. Rebecca had spent a sleepless night preparing for what she believed would be her last day in command. But she had also made a decision that would change everything. At 0600, an hour before the scheduled continuation of the inspection, Rebecca made her way to the base communications center. She had remembered something from her first week at Fort Harrison. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson had been meticulous about recording all training sessions and meetings, ostensibly for quality control purposes. If the recordings still existed, they might provide the evidence she needed. Sergeant Maria Gonzalez was on duty at the communications center, a young woman who had always been professional and respectful in her interactions with Rebecca. Good morning, Sergeant. I need to review some archived training recordings. Of course, ma'am. What time period are you looking for? The past 6 months, specifically any sessions conducted by Sergeant Thompson in the armory. Gonzalez pulled up the digital archive system and began searching. Ma'am, there are quite a few recordings here. Some of them are marked as restricted access. What kind of restricted access? Well, ma'am, it looks like Sergeant Thompson requested that some of his training sessions not be reviewed by command personnel. He said it was to protect his teaching methods from being taken out of context. Rebecca felt a surge of anger and excitement. Sergeant, I'm ordering you to provide me access to all training recordings, regardless of any restrictions that may have been placed on them. Yes, ma'am. I'll need to override the restrictions, but I can do that with your authorization. 20 minutes later, Rebecca